All right, we ready to go, Nick? Are we live here?
Yes, sir.
Okay, great. Hey, everyone. Gary Schoeniger here. Welcome to this webinar about creating entrepreneurial communities. I'm really appreciative that you all have taken a lot of time out of your day to join this webinar. I'm really excited to share with you some of what we're working on here. I'm going to be joined by my good friend Chris Thompson, who's sitting across the table from me. Chris is the founder of Civic Collaboration Consultants. He's written a really interesting book about collaboration as a handbook for the for civic collaboration. Chris will talk to you about that in a minute. Before we jump in, I want to get some housekeeping things figured out here. So there's a chat function, and I think it's at the base of your screen. If you can click on that chat function, it should show up on the right-hand side of your desktop, and just chime in and just let us know who you are, where you're from. Just say hello to everyone else who's here. We've got a really a precedent. There's a lot of people. We have several hundred people on this webinar. So just jump in and say hello and where you're from, and so we can get to know you. And throughout this webinar, what we'd like you to do is, if you have a question, just state your question in the chat function, and my colleague Nick Hool is standing by, and he'll kind of jump in and stop and interrupt, so this can be interactive and didactic. And I'm starting to see a lot of people. This is so exciting, people coming in from all over the country. Jennifer, welcome. Lee, Carol, Amity, Faith. Okay, great. Charles, Chu, Tom Darling. Oh, hey, Tom, glad you're on with us here. John Austin. Hey, John, you were in Albuquerque with us. You're going to see some familiar faces. Glad to have you. Cliff, Shashi. Great. All right. Now, let me jump in and get started here. I'm going to transition over to my slide deck. I don't think I'm sharing my slide. Bear with me here. I'm a little bit I'm going to share my screen now. And I think we're good to go. Nick, you'll tell me otherwise. All right, we're going to jump in. I see my little chat function here. Here. Lots of people chiming in here. All right, I got my chat function. I'm going to roll. So this webinar, as I said, is about creating entrepreneurial communities. My name is Gary Schoeniger. I'm the founder and CEO of the Entrepreneurial Learning Initiative. We're based in Cleveland, Ohio. And I'm joined today by Chris Thompson, the president of Civic Collaboration Consultants, also from Cleveland, Ohio. I hope very shortly in this webinar, you'll understand the synergy between the work that Chris is doing and the work of the Entrepreneurial Learning Initiative. So I'm going to, let's jump right in here. All right, or let's not. There we go. All right. The first thing I'm going to talk about is redefining entrepreneurship in a way that everyone can embrace. I'm then going to identify the core beliefs that drive entrepreneurial behavior. And I'm going to discuss 4 essential aspects of entrepreneurial support. When I'm done with that, we can pause, take some questions, have a little Q&A, and then I'm going to shift to Chris, who's going to talk about why cross-sector collaboration is necessary for creating entrepreneurial communities. He's going to describe 3 essential elements of effective cross-sector collaboration. And then finally, Chris is going to provide some examples and discuss some first steps for creating entrepreneurial communities. All right, so here we go. I'm just going to tell you a little bit about what we do with the Entrepreneurial Learning Initiative. Our area of expertise is entrepreneurial mindset education. We're focused on the mindset, the underlying beliefs that drive entrepreneurial behavior. We provide entrepreneurial mindset professional development, training, workshops, educator certification programs. and also curriculum consulting. That's the quick 15-second commercial for the Entrepreneurial Learning Initiative. Let's jump in on point one. Creating entrepreneurial communities requires us to redefine entrepreneurship in a way that everyone can embrace. And many of you have heard me say this in the past. We're at the dawn of a new workforce revolution, one that will require everyone to think like an entrepreneur. And I'm really hitting hard on the word think like an entrepreneur because I want to drive home the idea that you don't have to start a business to adopt an entrepreneurial mindset. I mean, we need entrepreneurial thinkers in established organizations, in the public sector, private, nonprofit sectors. We need to support entrepreneurial activity at all levels of society in all sectors. So, and it should be obvious to everyone that entrepreneurial activity is essential for creating vibrant, equitable, and sustainable communities. And really what I'm saying here is we need to democratize entrepreneurship. We need to kind of check some of our older last century assumptions, like sort of the great man theories about, you know, there are a few great entrepreneurs among us and everyone else has to, you know, be a traditional employee. So what are the benefits of learning how to think like an entrepreneur? I'll talk about that briefly. From the individual perspective, learning how to think like an entrepreneur, it exposes opportunities that tend to ignite ambition, they energize us, they activate the faculties, our innate capabilities, that it's the awareness. Once the opportunity is recognized, it activates within the individual the abilities, the creativity, the critical thinking, the collaborative mindset, the resilience, the resourcefulness required to be innovative and entrepreneurial. As I mentioned a second ago, the benefits, like we need entrepreneurial thinkers inside organizations. And I'm going to show you in a minute the sort of how that lines up with the goals of the 21st century educators. But we need entrepreneurial thinkers. I'll say this differently. Entrepreneurial attitudes, behaviors, and skills are the very same skills that employers have identified as essential for people to succeed in the workplace. God forbid, you know, that we call them soft skills, and I really don't like to use that term, but that's what folks are using to describe them. But we also need to think about the benefit to the community. I mean, the benefits of entrepreneurial activity across the community. I mean, entrepreneurs are those who not only invent new products and services, but improve existing products and services. They invent new products, they start new businesses, they create jobs that revitalize our communities. They're able to solve problems, environmental, political, socioeconomic problems. And they're able to do so in resource-constrained environments when the rules are not clear, when no one is there to tell them what to do, and no one is coming to the rescue. So the value of entrepreneurship is spreads across the community, from the individual, the organizations in the community, and the broader community itself. Suffice it to say that there is unlimited global demand for those who can think like an entrepreneur. And one of the things I've been writing about lately is the ways in which, you know, those who have an entrepreneurial mindset, and I'll describe what that is in a moment, they're able to recognize opportunities even in the most resource-constrained environments, whereby people who do not have an entrepreneurial mindset will often overlook opportunities even in the most opportunity-rich environments. The challenge that we all face is that our ability to embrace entrepreneurship is limited by the ways in which we define it, right? And there are a lot of entrepreneurial programs out there, and the entrepreneurship is the big thing in college campuses, small business development centers, community colleges, even, it's moving into high schools and even middle schools. But we're constrained in our ability to effectively teach entrepreneurship by the way that we define it. And what I mean is, a lot of these programs, typically community-based programs, college, university programs, they attempt to emulate the high-growth Silicon Valley model of these, the high-tech, high-growth, venture-backed entrepreneurs. And my point here is that we need those guys, but that's just a very narrow definition of entrepreneurship. Those are, by and large, statistical anomalies. And I've seen research that demonstrates that, less than a single % of all new businesses are created with venture capital. So for a lot of people, this venture-backed high-growth model of entrepreneurship is either totally irrelevant or it's just completely unrealistic and out of reach. Some people hear the word entrepreneur and they think of the small business owner, and there's lots of efforts to support small business ownership, and we need those guys too. But the tendency there is to sort of conflate entrepreneurial behavior with managerial behavior. And a lot of times they create a lot of confusion in that way. The broader point is we need to define entrepreneurship in a way that everyone can embrace. So if we're creating this bounded rationality, if we're defining entrepreneurship only as a business discipline. So let's come up with a way to define it so that everyone can embrace it. And what I want to do here is I want to take this classic definition of entrepreneurship from the legendary Harvard Business School professor Howard Stevenson, in which he described entrepreneurship as the pursuit of opportunity beyond resources controlled. I like this definition, and I just want to sort of make it in my own understanding to make it even more simple and accessible. I'm going to define it as an opportunity discovery process. And I think when we land on this simple definition, we've defined it in a way that anyone can apply it, whether you work in an existing organization or you're going to start a new company, you're going to join the gig economy. It's a discovery process, and essentially it's a process whereby an individual or a small group of individuals is searching for the intersection between their own interests and abilities and the needs of others. And so thinking of it as a discovery process enables anyone to embrace it. So that's kind of point one. Redefining it as a discovery process makes it accessible. I just want to put a follow-on point here that opportunity discovery requires opportunity discovery skills. And I've listed some of those skills here, such as empathy, observation and inquiry, experimentation, adaptation, creativity, critical thinking, communication, collaboration, financial literacy, problem solving, resourcefulness, agility, self-direction, self-regulation, and lifelong learning. I would say those skills are required on the individual, organizational, and community level. My point is, these are skills that anyone can learn to develop. They are simply skills that our systems of education, our culture has just historically undervalued, overlooked, or ignored. So they're pretty straightforward. The educators that it might be on this webinar, you can really clearly understand that these are skills that are very well aligned with the 21st century learning skills that big thinkers around the world have identified as essential for students to adapt and thrive. So now I want to shift gears and talk about the underlying beliefs that drive entrepreneurial behavior. And I'm going to keep this really quite simple. So we talk a lot about the entrepreneurial mindset. We're defining the mindset as the underlying beliefs and tacit assumptions that drive our behavior. You'll notice that I'm emphasizing the word underlying to indicate that much of our mindset is operating beneath our level of conscious awareness, yet it's influencing our decisions, our behavior, our choices without us necessarily being aware of it. So mindset works like an iceberg, right? What you see on the surface are the visible artifacts and observable behavior. Just beneath the surface, we can find our explicit or declarative knowledge and espoused values. But at the base of the iceberg that we cannot see is where we find our implicit or procedural knowledge, which is made up of deeply held, largely taken for granted beliefs and tacit assumptions. And what we know from the works of Edgar Schein and others is that what shows up on the surface is more likely to be the manifestation of our implicit or procedural knowledge, the deeply held, taken for granted beliefs and assumptions. And, you know, and Chris will speak to this in a moment, but there's such a thing as an individual mindset and a collective mindset. And this is how, like, we think about culture. There are deeply held, mostly taken for granted, tacit beliefs and assumptions, collective, that also influence our behavior. So I've now interviewed somewhere on the order of 500 entrepreneurs around the world. I'm still interviewing entrepreneurs for our upcoming podcast about the entrepreneurial mindset. It's a subject that's endlessly fascinating to me. But at the core of the common assumption of the entrepreneur, which is rarely articulated, is a deeply held, mostly unconscious assumption that it's my responsibility to figure out how to make myself useful to my fellow humans, to the people around me, the people in my work environment, the people in my community, the people in my department, the people in the broader world around me. Whether you work at Subway in a minimum wage job or you want to change the world, this is sort of the core assumption. What we see in experienced entrepreneurs as a result of this core belief and the pursuit of a compelling idea, we tend to see a high sense of self-efficacy, an internal locus of control. They tend to be intrinsically motivated, highly resilient, and they have a growth mindset, which is the belief that they can develop their talent and abilities. It's not fixed. My point here is that when we look at successful entrepreneurs and we see these things, these traits, I'll call them, we tend to then make this attribution error and think you need those traits to be a successful entrepreneur. Well, that's partially right, but it's partially misguided, because when we interview the entrepreneurs at the beginning of their journey, they have very little of this. So my point is that these 5 constructs of an entrepreneurial mindset, we call them the mechanisms of human agency, are the result. They're more so the result rather than the effect. They're an effect rather than the cause. Stumbled over that one. Okay, so lastly, I want to talk about 4 essential aspects of effective entrepreneurial support. And this is really, really important, and it's really, really simple. So let me first talk about the entrepreneurial journey. And some of you might be familiar with the work of Peter Senge and the 5th Discipline. Might also be familiar with the work of Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, who has done the work around flow, right, which is really the highest level of human engagement. So you'll notice, like, there's this current reality and there's a compelling future. And that's what the entrepreneurial-minded person is doing. He's pursuing something compelling, something on the horizon. And in the pursuit of that compelling goal, they're constantly being challenged above their level of skill, and not, way above their skill level, but they're constantly being challenged above their skill level. It's just a constant state of what Senge calls creative tension. lots of ambiguity, lots of setbacks, lots of wrong turns. Chris is also going to talk about, dead ends and backing up and not getting it right. So it requires us to stay in this state of what Senge calls creative tension long enough to get to the compelling goal. And I like this definition of that process from Richard Miller, the president of Olin College, and he calls it expeditionary learning, creating your own knowledge and inventing your own career. So in order to drastically increase the likelihood that you're going to survive that process, it's a good idea to adhere to these 4 concepts. And this is adapted from the work of Albert Bandura in his work on guided mastery. So guided mastery is about helping shift an individual from a helpless orientation towards a mastery orientation. It requires 4 basic concepts. The first is the individual, the entrepreneurial person that you're trying to cultivate needs what he calls an efficacy moment. I call it a small win. We need to feel the bat hit the ball once so we can start to imagine it's possible for us. This early win, this small win should come with some effort, but not too much effort. If it comes too easily, we're more likely to give up when it gets difficult. If it's too difficult, we're more likely to give up before we ever get any real traction. So there's a sweet spot there. Super important, we need relatable social models. So, for most people, Mark Zuckerberg, Elon Musk, Thomas Edison, Henry Ford, these are not relatable social models. They're iconic figures that seem out of reach or just, in many cases, they'll do more to discourage rather than to enhance this behavior. So people who are learning to be entrepreneurial should surround themselves or be surrounded with people who have come from similar or worse circumstances. Number 3 is they need a Sherpa. They need a mentor, a guide, a facilitator, someone who believes in them, but someone who is not telling them what to do, rather a facilitator or a mentor or a guide who is asking probing questions, someone who believes in that person's possibility, but isn't necessarily telling them what to do. And the 4th thing is you need the ability to regulate our emotional responses. It's very, very difficult. Being entrepreneurial is, we're betting against the status quo. We're going against the grain. We're doing things differently. It's going to require a lot of iterative experiments, a lot of rejection and failure. It requires the ability to self-regulate. So those are the 4 things that are really effective in cultivating entrepreneurial behavior in others. So I want to talk for about 2 minutes about the Icehouse Entrepreneurship Program. Many of you have heard of this. We are the creators of the Icehouse program, which was inspired by the life story of my co-author, Clifton Talbert, a Pulitzer nominee, who describes the entrepreneurial influence of his uncle who owned the local ice house as he came of age in the 1950s in the Mississippi Delta in a small cotton community. What this book is really all about is how do people that don't have access to power and privilege, resources, authority, how do they manage to be innovative and entrepreneurial in less than ideal circumstances? The book was translated into a learning program that's been recognized around the world. It does these basic things. It's designed to inspire the students with real-world examples, engage them in entrepreneurial activities, focus on the mindset as the broad applicability of the mindset. It's designed to connect the classroom and the community. The students of the program, as part of their work, are encouraged to go out in the community, identify and interact with local entrepreneurs, and invite them into the learning experience. And lastly, it's designed to be delivered on as facilitated delivery, so that the person facilitating the program does not need to be a subject matter expert in entrepreneurship. That's the quick design, the structure of the Icehouse program. It is being used in these ways in communities around the world, in high schools, community colleges, four-year universities, economic development initiatives, veteran initiatives, small business, libraries, re-entry programs. City governments are using the program, and nonprofit organizations. So as I'm wrapping up, I'm going to ask this question rhetorically: what if communities embraced entrepreneurship in all these different sectors within the community, right? What if we were embracing entrepreneurship across the community in ways that are represented here? So we do a lot of work with community colleges, and we think a community college is a great place to start. And I just want to point to this book that's coming out in February that's been published by some of the members of the National Association of Community College Entrepreneurship about community colleges as incubators of innovation. It's the subtitle I really like, is Unleashing Entrepreneurial Opportunities for Communities and Students. So that's the end of my presentation. I'm happy to take some questions now. Nick, if you could help out. I see there's a long list of chats and comments here. If there's any questions, Nick, that you want to jump in on in the meantime, yes, Brian, Becky does rock. But if you want to chime in, any questions in the meantime. Yeah, and Tom Darling is here. I want to introduce Tom. He's also on this webinar. Tom is working in the city of Albuquerque. He has taught hundreds of city government workers, and I'm hoping that we can direct some questions to Tom as well. And we've got another gentleman here, Rick Rennie from the city of Albuquerque. So I see a raised hand from Eloise here. Let me see if I can manipulate the technology. Hello, Eloise, I can see you. You're saying hello. What else am I missing here? Blanca Surgeon. Blanca, how are you? Okay, I'm having a hard time with the how do I use this the Q&A? Maybe Nick, you could help me out here. I see Eloise saying hello. I see Blanca saying hello, but I don't see the questions. Okay, Eloise, we are from Miami-Dade College Idea Center. We are very interested in a side conversation. Eloise, would love to talk to you after this call. And I saw someone ask this in the comments. We will send this entire slide deck with presenter notes within 24 hours of this webinar, so you'll have the slide deck. I'm sorry I didn't say that earlier. Could have avoided some furious. Pardon me? Another question here?
Blanca, what are some examples of small wins?
Okay. Blanca's where are you seeing? Blanca's asking some question about, like, what are some examples of small wins? It's a really good question, Blanca, and I would say it depends on the clientele that you're working with, but we want to get people out of the building and immersed in the experience relatively early in the experience. You know, some of you have heard me talk about you know, a young man that a foster child that I helped start a business when he was about 16 years old. You know, I asked him to go out and present an idea to, like, adults, and, you know, he kept getting rejected and getting rejected, but the rejections themselves were validating. Eventually, he found a customer. You know, somebody was interested in his idea. I can't say, Blanca, specifically what is a small win. It's just, it can be different from different people. I mean, in our trainings, we've had people go out and do an exercise where they just reach out, and they reach out to somebody they don't know or who might be intimidating to them, and they get a response. That's a small win. It's a great question. All right, I'm going to close this. Okay, there we are. Okay, and lots of people. Okay, great. Small wins. I see the question, Blanca. Gary, where can we find this document that the community colleges, incubators of innovation? Okay, thank you, Gary. This book is going to be published in February. I'm going to send you a link in the show notes after the webinar where you can pre-order the book. Thank you for asking that question. Faith is saying, Gary, can you speak on some of the success you've had implementing ELI programs into schools? Yes, we're seeing. You know, I'm going to talk about community colleges. The biggest impact I can speak to in community colleges is student retention, the student persistence. We did a blind study at one college where 1,000 students were randomly selected to take the Icehouse program. They persisted to the second semester at a rate 28% higher than the control group. That's a community college. That's one big data point. High schools are really starting to kind of kick in here. There's a private high school system across Mexico called Prepa Tech. They're putting about 7,500 seniors, last semester seniors, through the program. There's an outcomes report. It's on our website. I can send it to you if you send me an email, Faith. There's another implementation in middle schools in Erie, Pennsylvania. They just wrapped up a pilot, 850, these are seventh grade students, 12, 13-year-old students in a middle school. The outcomes of that were nothing short of astonishing. What these kids were saying, you know, I can now see a future for myself. I can now realize that I have the power to create something. Really, really exciting things were here. Brian is saying, an improvement on any day-to-day activity that saves you time, money, or improves process. There you go, Brian. It's a great comment. Blanca, we need more Tom Darlings. He's doing a great job in New Mexico. Thank you, Tom. I mean, you guys, like Tom Darling is really like one of our most prolific facilitators. He latched into this program like just practically when we launched it. And I would urge all of you to connect with him. If you could put your email in there. Tom is really effective in teaching Icehouse program in a workforce development capacity. Okay, so Tom, there he is. You can connect with him at jdarling@cabq.gov. Nick, could you talk a bit about the veteran initiatives? Yes, Nick, there are a number of veteran initiatives happening. I can't speak to all of them. There are two in Tampa. And Tampa's sort of, you know, emerging as sort of an entrepreneurial hub for veterans. There's Beth and Andy Gold and Beth Curley have developed a really effective entrepreneurship program for veterans at Hillsborough Community College. There's also something called Action Zone, also in Tampa, that's using our program to specifically for a veteran initiative. So Dean is saying, I'm more interested in corporate innovation, work with a lot of companies and seeing that many organizations are at least starting to understand how important innovation is, especially when it comes to grooming future leaders, which is also a big concern for many companies. Absolutely, Dean. I couldn't agree with you more. Tom Darling is really the guy there that can speak to how he's used our content to bring about organizational change from the bottom up. Teaching people like frontline city government workers how to think like entrepreneurs. And what's happening there, Rick Rennie, who's also on this call, on this webinar, can speak to that. And Dean, I'd be happy to chat with you offline. The Starting Block Incubator, Hart, Michigan, 100% 10 on board. Awesome. It's great to hear. Faith, please reach out. Nick, okay, great. All right. Any other questions about we're going to have some more Q&A at the end here. I want to, before this gets away from us, I'd like Chris to be able to chime in now and talk about civic collaboration and creating cross-sector collaboration to create entrepreneurial communities. So I'm going to, let's see if I can figure out how to get Chris to share. I'm going to stop my sharing. And Chris, it's up to you to take over the sharing now.
All right, thanks a lot, Gary. And it's a real pleasure to join Gary and all of you on this webinar. Gary ended one of his closing slides. He listed all the different kinds of organizations that have used the Icehouse program, and he asked the compelling question, what would it look like in our community if all of those kinds of organizations work together to create an entrepreneurial community? And that aspirational question can come true with the right kind of environment and the right kind of effort in your community, and that's what I'm going to be sharing today. If I can only advance my slides. There we go. So a little bit of background on me, since I think a lot of you know Gary and the entrepreneurial learning effort very well. I've been working on helping communities design and sustain collaborations for more than a decade. I work in a variety of civic systems, including entrepreneurship, economic development, health, transportation. There's actually somebody on our webinar today who I'm working with on a health-related collaborative effort. I used to work with a group of funders, 40+ foundations that banded together to invest in economic efforts in Northeast Ohio. And as Gary mentioned, back in October of 2016, they published a handbook that I wrote on collaboration. That handbook is available, electronic version, for download on civiccollab.com website for free. And if you'd like a hard copy of it, just drop me an email and I'd be glad to put one or two in the mail for you. And so I'm going to be sharing the lessons that are really in that handbook. But the foundational statement, I guess, for my presentation is that creating an entrepreneurial community really demands cross-sector collaboration. If you want a truly entrepreneurial community, you can't do it without collaboration, which means you better understand why that's the case, how to do it, and I'm going to end with a few tips on where you might start to get it going. So when we talk about cross-sector collaboration, we're really talking about working across these 4 sectors within the civic systems that we're talking about. In this case, for lack of a better term, we'll call it the entrepreneurial or the entrepreneurship system in our community. And those systems have 3 common characteristics. First, there's lots of independent stakeholders. I put up on the screen here a list that ranges from chambers of commerce to entrepreneurs themselves to universities, libraries, foundations, etc. All of those players together, we might say, make up the entrepreneurship system in our community. In general, those key players in such civic systems are funders, policymakers, who are oftentimes also funders, service providers, and the individuals with lived experience. And how well those players interact with each other has as much influence over what you get from your entrepreneurship system as the individual programs and strategies that those players implement. A second element of these civic systems is the challenges that they're dealing with are adaptive in nature as well as technical. So why is that important? Here's a quote from 2 leadership gurus from Harvard who've written many books on leadership, including Leadership on the Line. And as leaders, no one wants to be a failure. So if we can avoid the most common source of failure, we might as well do it. All it does is require us to understand the difference between an adaptive challenge and a technical problem. In the context of entrepreneurship, it could be as simple as a technical problem would be, gee, we need more capital to support entrepreneurs. The more adaptive challenge is building an entrepreneurial community. Technical problems, we kind of understand what the solution is. We may not have the resources to do a venture fund, but we certainly know what it takes to run a good venture fund. So if we have the authority to solve them, technical problems really depend on how well can we execute. The adaptive challenges are much more difficult to solve. There's no clear solution. Indeed, I would hazard that we don't even know what we mean by entrepreneurial community. Gary tried to lay out a pretty clear description of it, but it varies greatly from one community to the next. And the community has to rally around a shared understanding of what that looks like. So we run the risk of wasting resources and disappointing people when we bring a technical solution to an adaptive challenge. For example, if we want to build a truly entrepreneurial community, I've worked in communities where their answer to that was, because they knew how to do it, was to start a venture fund. But as Gary shared earlier, the definition of entrepreneur gets narrowed greatly if we view it through the lens of a venture fund. Only certain people can be successful entrepreneurs using a venture fund definition of entrepreneurship. So the message you're sending is most of you aren't good enough to be entrepreneurs. So that actually counteracts, your technical solution actually counteracts your efforts to build an entrepreneurial community. And I've watched some communities focus heavily on launching venture funds, and then they realize that that doesn't quite get to the solution we're looking for, and they, over time, develop more adaptive solutions to this challenge of building an entrepreneurial community. We may need to collaborate to solve a technical problem. Maybe you don't have enough money to do a venture fund on your own. You have to collaborate with others. To solve adaptive challenges, you have to collaborate. Saying you have to collaborate is easy. Doing it is a little bit harder, in part because nobody is in charge of these complex systems we're working in. We'd all like to be the woman on the left here pointing to who's in charge. And maybe some of us really enjoy being in charge. Most of us do not enjoy being the nice stick figure on the right. You know, we kind of feel like we're spiraling out of control. But the good news is, even in these complex systems, even though there's no single entity or small group of entities in control of the entrepreneurial outcomes, we can influence them by working together. But we have to understand what it takes to do it. And so here's my quick summary of these complex civic systems. No one's in charge of everything. Somebody's in charge. Lots of people are in charge of something, and progress depends on nearly everyone being engaged. There's a word for that. That's collaboration. Here's my definition for cross-sector collaboration, and I focus on, it's about assuming shared responsibility for achieving a mutually beneficial shared goal. If there's not something in it for you, I'm not sure why you're at the table advocating for an entrepreneurial community. And if you're not willing to assume some of the responsibility for getting the work done, you're really just interested in ordering people around. And that's not what works in this space. So that's the definition. Here's the reality of collaboration. It is all too often an unnatural act among non-consenting adults. And the reason that is the case is because we're not well trained in it. What we're trained in is the organizational structure. We all work for one. It's not a coincidence that it looks like a first grade seating chart. We've been trained in organization since the first grade. But the systems we work in, particularly the entrepreneurial system, looks like this. Doesn't even look this neat. It's a hodgepodge of independent players, all maybe interested in what we might agree is entrepreneurship, but there's no clear lines of authority, control. No one has the power to order anyone else around. We're really good at working in this. We're not as good at working in this. So one of the questions becomes, how do we get better at working in a system? Well, first step is understanding the difference between the system and the organization that we're accustomed to. And so I provide just a handful of differences between the two. I want to focus on the last one, which is every one of your organizations has a goal, and I'm pretty sure you can tell me what the goal is while standing on one leg. The reality is none of these civic systems that make up our community has a goal unless we collectively come together to give it a goal. And that's really hard work. It'd be much easier if we all knew how to collaborate really well, but unfortunately, we spend so much of our time when we say we're collaborating, collaborating. Collaboration is a made-up word. I've never had to define it, though. People get it. I did not make it up, by the way. The first time I heard it was the head of a school district. When I told him what I did, he said, "Oh, you facilimanipulate people," another made-up word, facilimanipulation. I facilitate manipulate people into collaboration. Guilty as charged, but I'm working on getting better at it. We have to get beyond collaboration and do true collaboration. And I'm willing to wager that most of you are very familiar with the left-hand side of this column and have spent not nearly enough time in the right-hand side of the column. And what I want to do is just spend a few minutes sharing with you the three essential elements of effective collaboration that will help you get beyond collaboration and into the kind of collaboration that can create the change, the entrepreneurial change you want in your community. The first step is process. And I can't see you all on this webinar, but I can almost feel you saying, ugh, process. Gary's nodding his head, yes. Nobody likes process except for process geeks. I'm not a process geek, but I've learned a deep admiration and respect for process geeks. Most of us want to just go get stuff done. But the reality is we need a process to get stuff done when we're working with something as complex as a civic system like the entrepreneurship system in our community. It needs to be rigorous and intentional. It needs to be a process fueled by data. Okay? In one community where we worked, the data told them that they were the worst community in the country when it came to entrepreneurship. And that data helped compel new behavior. It needs to be an inclusive process. As Gary talked about, entrepreneurship cuts across all elements of the community. It's not just the prototypical tech-based entrepreneur. We need to engage all of those different players that I highlighted into the design of any effort to make your community more entrepreneurial. It needs to be transparent. That community I referenced earlier that was in dead last in entrepreneurship, they weren't super transparent when they started out trying to make the changes. Some funding decisions were being made and people didn't understand why they were being made and it wasn't being well communicated. That burned some bridges and it's taken a long time to rebuild some of that doubt and suspicion in the community. So we have to share with folks the decisions that funders and policymakers and even the service providers are making as they begin to change and adapt so that we can all develop the entrepreneurial mindset. And you need to be prepared to make mistakes, get it wrong, go back and move forward. Quick example, I worked in a community where they wanted to make sure they didn't just touch the high tech entrepreneur. They wanted to touch every entrepreneur. So they built a very robust means very expensive, website in order to be a platform for all those entrepreneurs to get together and connect and get the resources they needed. It didn't work. They ended up shutting it down. But the good news was they took what they learned from that effort and adapted and put into place some practices that did allow more people to become engaged in the entrepreneurial system. The second big element of doing collaboration well is you got to have someone buying the donuts. If nothing else, I love the image of donuts, right? It breaks up a boring PowerPoint presentation. You need capacity to do collaboration well, and there's no really good image to illustrate capacity, so that's why I use donuts. More importantly, collaboration requires lots of meetings, which are usually held in the morning, which means someone's got to organize the coffee and donuts. And somebody's got to do more than just schedule. They have to foster shared learning so we understand what is it we're talking about when we say the word entrepreneurship. How do we engage the diverse stakeholders? How do we communicate among everybody? There's dozens of players, if not hundreds, that we need to communicate with. How do we possibly do that if no one has the job of working on the collaboration process? You need to catalyze shared vision, facilitate shared measurements so you know how you're doing as a community, and obviously advocate for the policy changes and the resources you need to be successful. That's a ton of work. And it's so much work that's why collaborations often fail, because there's not enough people to do that work. I highly encourage you not to collaborate unless you can figure out ahead of time who's going to do this kind of work. It doesn't require a new organization to be created. Sometimes you can just share resources, but you have to clearly designate the resources and capacity to do these functions. Because if you don't do these functions, your collaboration will fail, and that is just a waste of resources. Even if you have a well-funded, high-capacity collaboration with a wonderful process, it will also fail with the wrong kind of leadership. Not the leadership that we're accustomed to, where it's somebody up on the pedestal, but the kind of leadership that helps diverse, independent players put the pieces of a puzzle together. You have to behave differently. And I borrow from Paul Schmitz, a colleague out of Milwaukee, who uses these 3 points to define collaborative leadership. It's about action, not a position of power. It's about taking responsibility yourself to work with others on shared goals. And it requires us to practice some specific values that engage commitment from others. And what are those values? The values that I've seen that work in collaborative leadership are leaders who value the change more than the glory and the control. Now, trust me, we all say this is what we want and these other values that I'm going to share. I haven't met anybody who says, hey, I'm in it for the glory and the control. I don't care about the outcomes. We may say we value these things, but we have to look in the mirror and ask ourselves, do we really? And as we look around our communities, unfortunately, it becomes clear that there's not enough of us who value these things because we're not getting the outcomes from the civic systems that we want. Another value is collaborative leaders value engagement with others, particularly those with the lived experience. What's the perspective of an entrepreneur, and how do we engage them in the design of a more entrepreneurial community? We value data that will help us challenge our assumptions rather than using anecdote to affirm our assumptions and preserve the status quo for those in power. We value the co-creation of solutions because we know we don't have the answers ourselves, and we value the process of learning through mistakes. We embrace failure. We're not afraid of it. I've done work with a handful of different leadership programs, and we've identified 3 skills that collaborative leaders use regularly in order to sustain effective collaboration. The first one is inquiry, asking compelling questions like the one Gary asked earlier. What would our community look like if everyone who could embrace an entrepreneurial community did embrace it? What would our community look like? How would we feel? Who would we need to invite to that table? Those are the questions that collaborative leaders ask. Leaders work hard at understanding context. Who is willing to change? Who is in turf protection mode? When are things possible? What needs to be moved around the field, so to speak, in order to get things to happen? And the most important skill is building trust. Collaboration moves at the speed of trust. We never have enough trust. And in today's national environment, clearly, trust is very low. It's our job as leaders to build trust. Do separate workshops on how to do that, but there are very clear, very well-established ways that we can build trust in our communities. And if you want to build an entrepreneurial community, the first thing you can do is work on building trust. In summary, to do cross-sector collaboration well, we've got to embrace the complexity of the system, the lack of control, the sheer volume of participants. We need that process capacity and leadership to do it well. And most importantly, I tell folks, you have to be prepared to change. As one of our fellow panelists talked earlier today, everybody's got a plan until Mike Tyson punches him in the face. And then things change and you got to adapt. I want to just close with just a couple quick tips on how you might get started in building an entrepreneurial community. First, take the time to learn a little bit more about what's been tried in the past. Because I can't imagine there's a community in America that hasn't had some sort of entrepreneurship initiative that has gone on. You should take the time to understand what worked and what didn't work, and what kept it a program versus allowing it to spread and be more pervasive across the entire community. Do not convene all the stakeholders and say, hey, wouldn't it be great if we were an entrepreneurial community? What should we do together to make it an entrepreneurial community? Please don't do that. Trust is built one-on-one, and building trust is fundamental to this work. So hold a bunch of one-on-one conversations. Figure out who your best friends are, people who would share your commitment to building an entrepreneurial community, and engage them and have them participate with you in the next round of conversation. If you've got a core group that's working on it, I encourage you to think about an exercise that my colleagues at Co-Creative, a consulting firm in DC, uses. They talk about defining the frame of the issue you're trying to tackle. Entrepreneurship, as Gary described, is pretty big. There's a lot of things that could be in that frame. There's a lot of things that could be outside that frame. Think about the frame of a picture of your holiday, your beach vacation, right? And by the way, this is not my family. Thanks to Google Images, I was able to find this picture. You know, what's in the frame of the picture? What's included and what's not when you say the word entrepreneurship? And what's in focus in the frame? What do we want most out of an entrepreneurial community? As you begin to develop that, then you can develop that shared understanding of what you're presently getting. And you can then ask the questions about the compelling questions about what should we be getting? What do we want to get? And what are the changes we need to make about our own behavior so that we can start to get them? At this point, I'm going to turn it back over to Gary and his colleagues to hopefully add some more perspective in the entrepreneurial sector, particularly on these issues. And I look forward to your questions.
Good. Thank you, Chris. Hold on a second. Muted here. There, I'm unmuted. Let me see if I can get I don't know if I need my slides back up here or I don't. So what I'd like to do now is invite our friends into the conversation, Rick Rennie and Jim Carell. I want to reintroduce them to the conversation. Both Jim and Rick are actively working to create entrepreneurial communities. And Rick is in a fairly large community of Albuquerque. Jim is working in a population of 9,500 in Independence, Kansas. Both of these gentlemen have been working for a number of years now to create entrepreneurial communities, for lack of a better word. So Rick, I'm just going to start with you. You know, we talked about the different places of engagement with entrepreneurship education, the community college and nonprofit organizations. Talk to us a little bit about what you're doing, your efforts to create entrepreneurial community in Albuquerque.
Okay, well, first let me clarify a few things. I found the best way to create an entrepreneurial community is to do it covertly and by not focusing on it. So let me make that clear. What I focus on is solutions. If I ask people, do you want to have an entrepreneurial community? Probably most of them are going to, what are you talking about? But if I ask people if they would like a community that's safer and more prosperous, 99.9% will say yes. So then my goal is to show them why thinking and acting entrepreneurially is the most effective way to create that. So I have groups that I've worked with now for 3 years that have solved some major issues in homelessness and housing for one. A small team worked together. We worked exclusively in an entrepreneurial way, and they would never self-identify as that. The word entrepreneur never came up, but the process of thinking and acting entrepreneurially was the essence of how we were successful. And I would go so far as to say in today's environment, you cannot bring about those changes to make your community safer, more educated, more prosperous without thinking and acting entrepreneurially. Ultimately, there is no other way to get there. That process is how you identify a solution accurately, you respond to the challenges iteratively, and you get it done.
Right. You start where you are with what you got and who you know, and you get it done.
And you can't think entrepreneurially without acting entrepreneurially. I want to make that point clear. It's impossible by definition.
Yeah, I like that. But Rick, I also like what you said about like so many of the entrepreneurs I've interviewed, like they don't self-identify as entrepreneurs, or at least they didn't when they began. And I think that's an important point, and that's why we need to redefine the term, because people just don't identify with Mark Zuckerberg or someone that owns a bakery or a storefront. They just don't think of themselves in that way. But as you said, they're people that are identifying and solving problems in their domain with the resources they have, and so forth.
Yeah. And the first step is to help. Every community's got problems, and every community has people already working on them, and a lot of them not being effective. I work across state governments, city governments, organizations, and organizations are notorious for isolated responsibility. Not much gets done when there's isolated responsibility. Each department does their own thing. They can't connect it to the next department. So you need to identify an outcome in such a way that people can see what needs to change. And then you need to get a shared responsibility for that outcome, regardless of what role each person plays. And that is an entrepreneurial action, and it always gets results. And you have to prove that you get results. It's a very effective way to make things happen.
Good. Jim, what about you? Can you talk about like your journey to sort of revitalize your community? I don't know if that's what you set out to do, but
no. We, like Rick said, we did not set out to create an entrepreneurial community, but here's what happened. I started doing the Icehouse curriculum in 2012 and began sort of building an entrepreneurial community, one of these classes at a time. And then we started talking about doing a makerspace. And in 2014, we created a makerspace here that's kind of insanely involved with entrepreneurship and small business support. And that has kind of built an entrepreneurial community while we really were just concerned with helping individual people act and be more entrepreneurial.
Yeah. And Jim, can you talk to me a little bit about, the different, like Rick just talked about people that didn't self-identify as entrepreneurs. Like I know, like in the early days when you were teaching the Icehouse entrepreneurial mindset programs, like you had all manner of people showing up that they weren't all interested in starting businesses per se. Can you talk a little bit about that?
No, we still do. We have retirement age people, and one of your slides had library on the list. We had a library person last year. So we have a gamut of people. Some of them just want to be more entrepreneurial. Some of them want to start businesses. Some of them want to work and be more entrepreneurial within their business. And then we have a few community college students in there. We are part of a community college. And so we have a good mix every semester of all kinds of people.
Yeah, awesome. So I want to make sure this is open, like in the chat function. Anyone feel free to jump in and start asking questions here in the chat window. I'll try to relay them. Chris, you got a question here.
Yeah, Brian asked.
You got to unmute there you go.
Brian had asked a question about where is equity in the collaboration process, and I would just want to emphasize that that's a great question, and that without bringing the equity lens to collaboration, it does not work. I unfortunately conflate inclusion and equity too often, and need to update my presentation to make sure that I emphasize the issues of equity. We do not want to use collaboration or use entrepreneurship to perpetuate the inequity that's already exists in our communities.
Great point. Thank you, Chris. Any other questions from the audience, please? Okay, Brian, thank you, Chris. Jim, can you talk about like challenges, or Rick, like challenges, like, trying to get everyone on the same page and some of the challenges that you've seen?
I would say for us, it's just happening organically, and that's of course slower than we'd like. But then when you look back, a lot a lot of good things have happened. So it's just people are busy in their lives, and getting them to take time to take a class, or in some cases even come into a makerspace and do work. It's hard to communicate. It's hard to make them understand what it's like, both the class and the makerspace, until they come in and try it.
Well, Jim, I'm going to pull something out of your story. I have an unfair advantage, and I've been hanging around with you, but like, you've kind of drawn community stakeholders into it by begging for forgiveness rather than asking for permission. In
Yes.
some ways, I mean, you kind of like, you started out, you were the, I'm not sure your exact title, but you're like teaching entrepreneurship at Independence Community College. And you started teaching the Icehouse program, then you launched the Fab Lab, but you started to create a vision for something bigger. Can you talk a little bit about that, how you got the college president behind you, how you got Dr. Barwick to kind of come into and other stakeholders in the community? I mean.
Well, Dr. Barwick, the college president, he kind of came around. We had a building here that was not being utilized, and especially when he figured out that we could probably come up with the money without putting a strain on the college budget, he saw it as a good way to use that asset. And really, over the last couple of years, we say that this entrepreneurial thinking and the thinking that comes from a makerspace, it gives people a different future. It gives them a different view of the future. I think you or somebody mentioned that before in this webinar. When that's our motive, that's really our only motive. Everybody that works in the Fab Lab, our motive is to help people see a better future for themselves. And when you do that, I think you can get by with taking some of these liberties, and you don't even have to ask for forgiveness too much. But we do a lot of stuff without asking for permission first. That's for sure.
Yeah. And Rick, I'm going to get to you in a second, but someone is asking you, Jim. Gary Damer is saying, how did the effort get started in the smaller town? I think that's directed at you, Jim.
Yes, that was a nucleus of us that kind of started because of the Icehouse class. A small nucleus of us started learning about makerspaces and Fab Labs, and pretty soon we were saying, well, we ought to have one someday, and then that one thing led to another, and then pretty soon we were just able to make it happen. So it just started organically like that. But I credit it to this entrepreneurial mindset that happened from the Icehouse starting in 2012.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that, in both your case and in Rick's case, like, you weren't an elected official. Neither of you was tasked with this by an authority figure. No one was paying you to do this. This wasn't part of your job description. And I think that's an important part of the conversation here. I mean, both of you guys just kind of stepped into the fray, recognizing the need and taking it upon yourself to start marching down that path. Do you think that's accurate, Rick?
Yeah, I'd say that's accurate.
Yeah.
I would say on that, one of your slides, Gary, said we'd all need to figure out how we're going to be useful to others. And I'm not smart enough to have done that ahead of time, but now that I've done it, when you see that light bulb go off in people, for somebody like me, that's very, very satisfying.
Yeah.
Agreed.
Yeah. So, Rick, can you talk a little bit about what's happening in Albuquerque?
Well, that's a big question, Gary.
Well, like, what's happening? How did it get started in the big community? Like, what started this initiative to make Albuquerque an entrepreneurial community?
I don't even know how many years ago it was now, 5, 6. I was actually working on some revitalization projects as part of my role in a real estate development project downtown. And I was seeing a lot of activity around entrepreneurship, and I didn't find any of it really what I thought it should be. And I came across you on the internet and called you guys up and went to your course. And when I was sitting in your course, I said, we need to train our city employees in this type of thinking, because I did a lot of interaction with the city. So long story short, I think I told you that and you thought I was crazy. And I came back here and I actually approached the mayor with the C&M college, and one person from the college and I went to the mayor, and over a period of 4 months convinced them to commit to teaching 100 employees in the entrepreneurial mindset. Tom was the person that taught most of those people. Subsequent to that, the city hired Tom, and I went back to the mayor and suggested he commit to 3,000 for the Global Entrepreneurship Week, which he did, and now that process is underway, and I think Tom is on number 600 or whatever. But I always wanted this to go bigger than that. Getting the city employees trained was just one step to being able to go out to the community and work with people from the private sector. Because if you do not put these principles into practice, it won't go anywhere. The training will evaporate like everything else. If people are not using the principles and seeing results, at least on a weekly basis, they will lose interest. So my efforts have been I've started, co-founded a homelessness program years ago that is still in existence. We've housed almost 1,000 people now and have started several other programs, but that crosses multiple agencies, administrations, service providers, private providers, and all of those have been done by using entrepreneurial principles really without calling them so. We identify a problem clearly. If you identify a problem clearly, you quickly find out that a lot of the people that are trying to solve it are operating by confirmation bias. They've got an idea they want to work, and they are looking for a way to prove that it works rather than checking to see if the idea is actually working. So carefully, we've been able to correct a lot of those misdirections. And I'm going to say carefully there very importantly, because usually they're people in power that are pushing for those solutions that don't really work. But that's where the entrepreneurial mindset comes in. If you can't get support now, you go in a back door and find a way to help somebody else see that direction is not going to work.
Rick,
I think, Chris, you kind of brought that point up. Like, you need somebody that steps in as a sort of a champion that's willing to kind of suffer those slings and arrows.
Yeah, I talked about earlier the collaborative leadership skill set that's required, and at the same time, you need what I call galvanizing leadership, the kinds of folks who can withstand those arrows, the folks that you can count on when the going gets tough, that they're not going to give up. And I have a question for Rick. Like, what have you seen as the hurdles for spreading the entrepreneurial mindset across a broader community in Albuquerque? And it sounds like you've found your way around at least some of those hurdles. What are some of your best tips for getting around those who, maybe stuck in confirmation bias land?
Well, you have to do a lot of research and find out how powerful they are, who are the people that they are influenced by, and what pressures they will respond to. Sometimes when somebody's really stuck on an idea, if I will go and try to get everybody engaged in the process of validation and taking them through steps to validate certain things we're proposing to do. And when they get in that process of validating and see that it works, then you switch back the focus to the problem that somebody is pushing, because they're pushing a solution that doesn't work, and you can introduce them to look at it. Or oftentimes they will say, well, we need to re-examine everything we're doing with the same validation process. So then when somebody associated with the person in power who's supporting a process that's not working starts trying to validate that process, you've got somebody that person is more likely to listen to, and the anger, if there is any, is deflected from the core group and from me. Gary, I've lost you.
So Brian is asking, Rick, what are you measuring as success?
I have a very clear outcome. The beginning of every process is to identify if we're going to solve homelessness, we break it down into very clear goals. I think it's, in order to tackle a big problem, you have to have small incremental steps that you can compellingly connect to the greater outcome, so you don't lose support as you struggle, because with these big problems, you're going to get punched about a lot. So I have predetermined levels of success that are very clear, and everybody knows what they are, and there's celebration when we reach them. But they are always connected to the greater income. And it's a lengthy process to do that. And a lot of people get upset and say, we don't want to do it. We want something simpler. And I said, if I just force it, I mean, now people get it. You've got to break it down into something you can act on and know that you're successful, or you're not going to get there.
Yeah, that's a great point. We talked earlier about you need capacity to measure your progress. And when you're working on a big issue, whether it's homelessness or entrepreneurship, sometimes you can get caught in a trap where you say, well, it's going to take a long time to move the needle. And in our experience, you really have to have at least some measures of success that move in 6 months or less, or people are going to lose interest, they're going to lose confidence. And I loved, Rick, your point of each time you achieve that success, there's going to be a celebration. If you don't get in that habit early of measuring your success, capturing it, communicating and celebrating it, you'll look up one day and a lot has changed, but nobody really even recognizes the change, let alone the role you played in creating that change, because you weren't tracking it. And people don't recognize where that change came from, and that can really hurt the sustainability of your effort.
Yeah, agreed. And when people in the community, especially people that typically can be negative or the naysayers, when you can connect each success you have in a meaningful and believable way to the desired outcome, it shuts those people up really quick. Because the other people say, these people have thought it through, they know what they're doing. I can see how this is the first step in getting there. You get tremendous community support, at least enough to overcome naysayers along the way. Because there's nothing I've participated in that hasn't challenged what somebody is already doing that isn't working. So that's always those people that are, their way of doing it is being shown not to be the most effective, or go through a period of not being happy about that.
It also speaks to sort of the Bandura thing, and you need the small wins, not only for the outward facing message, but the inward facing message, I think is part of what you alluded to, Rick.
Yes.
Is the people, they need to know, like, okay, this is possible. We're starting to get somewhere. And if that doesn't happen fairly early on, we're going to give up. I mean, that's just human nature.
Yeah, and if there are people within a city organization, they're being asked to act differently than they ever have, to take full responsibility for an outcome. And it's fearful. It scares them. So you need to have something in there. And when they see that by changing that fear of what's going to happen to them, to focus on how do we get past this problem, it's fascinating to see how they change, and then how they're more and more likely to do that. And that's where the lessons in the class become reality, and they're integrated into that person's life and way of doing things.
Got it. Thank you, Rick. Any other questions on the panel here? Any questions for Chris? Any questions about the Icehouse Entrepreneurship Program? As we're winding up, I just want to thank everyone. I want to bring your attention to this fabulous little book that Chris wrote, and we'll put a link to it. You can download it for free on his website about creating cross-sector collaboration. We'll put that in the show notes. I want to thank Rick and Jim for joining this. I mean, great examples of stakeholders who are just stepping up. Faith is saying thank you. This has been really insightful. Thank you, Faith. I really appreciate that. If you want to learn more about the Icehouse Entrepreneurship programs, we'll also provide links to that in the follow-up email in the presenter notes. If you have any final questions, we'll hang around for a couple of minutes. I also want to draw your attention back to Tom Darling. His contact information is here. Tom has really been the guy delivering effectively the Icehouse Entrepreneurship programs in Albuquerque, both in an academic setting and in as a workforce development tool. So Tom has put his link in there, the publicservicelearningacademy.com. You can learn more about his work there. Ron, thank you. Great session. Carol Edwards, thank you. Hope to bring this to my institution. Carol, happy to help in any way we can. Warren, great to hear from you. We got to connect. Warren Munich is an entrepreneurship professor and an economist at Pikes Peak Community College. Another just supercharged individual fighting to make a difference in his community. Thank you, Warren. Blanca, I can't wait to see you again. We met in Las Vegas some time ago. Want to know more about what you're doing. Jim is saying, yes, Warren rocks. We know it. Warren definitely rocks. Thank you. So thank you all for joining. Any final comments, suggestions? I appreciate all the love. This has also been Facebook Live, which is why we have millennials in our office. So thank you to everyone who's participated. Again, Rick and Jim, thank you. Chris, so great to have you as part of this webinar. I have a feeling that we're going to continue to be collaborating in the future.
Hopefully we can avoid collaboration.
Correct. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Gary, for the opportunity.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.